Hey guys, tonight we're ranking every major street drug by price, from the cheapest desperate high to the most absurdly expensive powder that costs more than your car. Not the fun kind of shopping list, not the kind of thing you'd want on your browser history. I mean the actual brutal economics of substances that ruin lives, one transaction at a time. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And a huge thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. Your input genuinely shapes what we explore and helps this channel grow. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Somehow it's always 2 AM somewhere. Oh, and the channel is now live on Spotify, so if you prefer listening there, check out the link in the description. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, get comfortable, and maybe hide your credit card so you don't accidentally budget for anything we're about to discuss. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered why some drugs cost pennies while others require a small fortune? What makes one substance cheaper than a cup of coffee and another worth more than gold? How do dealers even price this stuff? Is there a Yelp for illegal markets? Could you accidentally afford the wrong high and end up either underwhelmed or bankrupt? Would you survive even knowing the markup on some of these things? Or would you spend the rest of your life questioning every financial decision humanity has ever made? And now, congratulations, you've just opened the darkest economics textbook ever written. The year is any year, really, because this market never closes. You have no DEA badge, a morbid curiosity, and you're about to learn that capitalism works everywhere, even in places it absolutely shouldn't. Good luck. Let's start at the absolute bottom of the barrel, where desperation meets convenience store shelving. Synthetic cannabinoids, sold under names like Spice, K2, or whatever sounds vaguely mystical enough to trick teenagers, cost about as much as a candy bar. You can buy them in gas stations, smoke shops, or from that guy behind the dumpster who swears they're totally legal, bro. They're sprayed onto plant material in facilities that would make a health inspector weep, packaged in shiny foil pouches and marketed as incense or potpourri with labels that scream "not for human consumption," while everyone absolutely knows what they're for. The genius of synthetic cannabinoids, if you can call it that, is that they're constantly evolving. Every time the government bans one chemical formula, underground chemists just tweak a molecule here or there, and suddenly you've got a brand new legal high that technically doesn't violate any laws yet. It's like playing whack-a-mole with chemistry, except the moles are potentially lethal, and the hammer's always 6 months behind. The stuff they spray on random plant matter, because yes, it's literally just herbs from someone's backyard coated in laboratory chemicals, bears no relation to actual marijuana beyond the vague promise that it might make you feel something. And oh, you'll feel something alright. Users report experiences ranging from mild relaxation to full psychotic breaks, where they're convinced spiders are living under their skin. There's no quality control, no dosage guidelines, and absolutely no guarantee that the packet you bought today contains the same chemicals as the one you bought yesterday. It's pharmacological Russian roulette for $3. The high, when it doesn't send you to the emergency room, lasts maybe 30 minutes of paranoid confusion, followed by a headache that feels like someone's squeezing your brain through a juicer. Hospitals have reported cases of people arriving with rapid heartbeats, seizures, kidney damage, and psychological breaks that last for days. And because these chemicals are so new and constantly changing, doctors often have no idea what they're treating. It's like showing up to a hospital and saying, "I ingested mystery powder number 743, please fix me," while the medical staff frantically Googles chemical formulas and prays they guess right. The demographic for synthetic cannabinoids is predictably depressing teenagers who can't afford real weed, people on probation who need something that won't show up on drug tests, and individuals so desperate for an escape. that they're willing to smoke something that was never intended for human consumption. It's marketed as a legal alternative to marijuana, but it's about as similar to actual cannabis as a hand grenade is to a firecracker. Sure, they both make noise, but one of them is significantly more likely to ruin your life. The real kicker: these substances were originally developed by legitimate scientists studying the endocannabinoid system, the part of your brain that marijuana interacts with. They were never meant to be recreational drugs. They were research tools, created in laboratories to help understand how cannabis works in the human body. Then someone figured out you could spray them on oregano, package it in shiny foil, and sell it to people desperate enough not to ask questions. Capitalism truly finds a way. So yes, for the price of a cheap lunch, you can purchase a substance that might give you 30 minutes of questionable relaxation, or might send you into a paranoid spiral where you're convinced the walls are melting and the government is broadcasting directly into your molars. It's the dollar store of drug experiences, and like most things from the dollar store, you absolutely get what you pay for. Inhalants are the saddest substances on this list, and that's saying something. We're talking about huffing glue, gasoline, paint thinner, or aerosol cans, things you can find under your sink or in your garage. A single session costs almost nothing because you're not buying drugs, you're abusing household products. Teenagers gravitate toward inhalants because they're accessible, cheap, and don't require dealers or dark web passwords. Just grab a plastic bag, spray in some computer duster, and inhale your way toward brain damage that's both immediate and permanent. The appeal of inhalants, if we're being brutally honest, is pure convenience. You don't need a connection, you don't need to ask your older brother's sketchy friend, and you don't need to figure out cryptocurrency. You just need to walk to your garage and grab whatever aerosol can is sitting next to the lawnmower. Spray paint, air freshener, whipped cream dispensers. If it comes in a pressurized container and makes a hissing sound, someone somewhere has tried to get high off it. It's like a horrifying scavenger hunt where the prize is oxygen deprivation. The high from inhalants is immediate and devastating. Within seconds of inhaling, users experience dizziness, euphoria, and a sense of floating, which sounds pleasant until you realize it's because you're literally suffocating your brain. The effect lasts maybe 5 to 15 minutes, and it's followed by a crushing headache, nausea, and the kind of disorientation that makes you forget where you are and why your mouth tastes like industrial chemicals. Your body is screaming at you that you just poisoned yourself, and your brain is too oxygen deprived to properly process the warning. Here's the really terrifying part: inhalants kill you in ways that are both immediate and long-term. Sudden sniffing. Death syndrome is exactly what it sounds like. Your heart just stops, right there, first time or 50th time. No warning. One moment you're huffing paint thinner in your friend's basement. The next moment you're a cautionary tale at a high school assembly. But even if you don't die immediately, chronic inhalant abuse destroys your brain, your liver, your kidneys, and your bone marrow. It's not a question of if it causes permanent damage. It's a question of how much damage you can accumulate before your body gives up entirely. The demographic is heartbreaking. We're talking about kids, mostly 10, 11, 12 years old, who don't understand the consequences and just know that the stuff under the bathroom sink makes them feel weird and floaty for a few minutes. By the time they realize what they've done to themselves, they're already dealing with cognitive impairment, memory loss, and motor control problems that won't ever fully heal. You can't unkill brain cells. They don't regenerate. Once they're gone, they're gone. And the worst part? Society barely acknowledges inhalant abuse because it doesn't fit the narrative of drug addiction. There's no street corner dealer, no cartel, no Breaking Bad style drama. Just a kid in a suburban garage with a can of dust-off in a plastic bag, slowly erasing their own future one huff at a time. It's too depressing for after-school specials and too common to ignore, so mostly it just exists in this horrible limbo where everyone knows it's happening but nobody wants to talk about it. The cost is almost zero, the consequences are permanent. And somewhere right now, a teenager is standing in front of an open cabinet, looking at a can of something they shouldn't inhale and making a decision that might end their life before they graduate middle school. That's the economics of inhalants, nearly free to obtain, impossible to undo. Dextromethorphan, better known as DXM, is the active ingredient in over-the-counter cough syrups, and it's been the drug of choice for broke high schoolers since someone discovered that drinking an entire bottle of Robitussin makes you hallucinate. A bottle costs about as much as a fast food meal, which is why it's so popular among people with limited funds and even more limited judgment. The high is described as dissociative, robotic, and deeply unpleasant, like being trapped inside a malfunctioning video game where your body won't respond to your brain's increasingly panicked commands. The beauty of DXM, from a teenage perspective, is that it's completely legal to purchase. You walk into any pharmacy, grab a bottle of generic cough syrup, pay your $7, and walk out with a substance that, when consumed in quantities that would horrify the manufacturer, produces effects somewhere between drunk and disconnected from reality. No ID check, no prescription, no questions asked. Just you, a cashier making minimum wage, and a bottle of cherry-flavoured dissociation. The experience itself is divided into what users call plateaus, which is a fancy way of saying there are different levels of awful depending on how much you drink. First plateau is mild stimulation, like drinking too much coffee while slightly dizzy. Second plateau brings euphoria and altered perception. Things look weird, sounds are distorted, and your body feels heavy and disconnected. Third plateau is where it gets properly dissociative. You're detached from your physical form, experiencing closed-eye hallucinations, and possibly questioning whether you exist at all. Fourth plateau is basically anesthesia. You're gone, completely out of your body, having experiences that users describe as meeting entities or exploring other dimensions, which is a poetic way of describing acute drug-induced psychosis. The problem with DXM is that the effective dose sits uncomfortably close to the toxic dose, and there's no good way to measure how your body will process it. Some people metabolize it quickly, some slowly, and some have genetic variations that make them ultra-sensitive. You're essentially playing pharmacological roulette with a substance designed to suppress coughs, not induce out-of-body experiences. And because it's a legal product with legal dosing instructions, people assume it's safe, which it absolutely is not when you're chugging 3 bottles in an hour. The immediate side effects are spectacularly unpleasant nausea, vomiting, intense itching, blurred vision, and a phenomenon called robo-walk, where users stumble around like malfunctioning automatons because their motor control has completely abandoned ship. You're not high in any enjoyable sense. You're impaired, confused, and probably regretting your choices while simultaneously unable to articulate that regret, because your mouth isn't cooperating with your brain anymore. Long-term abuse causes even worse problems. Chronic users develop tolerance rapidly, meaning they need more and more to achieve the same effect, which speeds up the path toward liver damage, brain lesions, and psychological dependence. Some people report experiencing dissociative symptoms for months after stopping, feeling detached from reality, experiencing derealization, and struggling to reconnect with their own bodies. You took cough syrup to escape yourself, and ended up permanently slightly divorced from your own consciousness. And here's the absurdity all of this happens because someone somewhere discovered that the medicine designed to stop you from coughing also happens to bind to the same brain receptors as ketamine and PCP when taken in massive doses. It's harm reduction through ignorance. The medicine works perfectly fine at recommended doses, But at 10 times that amount, it becomes a completely different drug with completely different and completely awful effects. For $5 to $10, you can experience what it's like to be a consciousness, without a body, which sounds philosophical until you're vomiting cherry-flavoured syrup while your legs refuse to hold your weight. That's the DXM experience, cheap, legal, and absolutely not worth it. Before everyone discovered you could cook these into methamphetamine, ephedrine and pseudoephedrine were just innocent decongestants sitting on pharmacy shelves, helping people breathe through their colds. Now they're the precursor to Breaking Bad cosplay, sold in limited quantities with your ID scanned into a federal database. For those not interested in becoming amateur chemists, these pills can still be abused on their own for a jittery, anxious high that feels like drinking 12 espressos while running from something you can't see. The government's relationship with pseudoephedrine is a masterclass in closing the barn door after the horse has not only left, but started a rural methamphetamine epidemic. For decades, you could buy boxes of Sudafed without anyone batting an eye. Then suddenly the 2000s arrived, meth labs started exploding in trailer parks across America, and legislators realized that maybe making the key ingredient available by the caseload wasn't the best plan. Now you have to show ID, sign a log, and explain to a pharmacist why you need more than one box of cold medicine, all while cameras record you for a federal database tracking pseudoephedrine purchases. It's privacy invasion in the name of public health, and it's absolutely necessary because humans cannot be trusted with chemistry. When taken as directed, pseudoephedrine is fine, mildly effective at clearing sinuses, slightly stimulating, nothing to write home about. But when you start popping them like candy, chasing that amphetamine-adjacent buzz, things get weird fast. Your heart starts racing like it's training for a marathon you never signed up for. Your hands shake, your pupils dilate. You feel energized but also vaguely panicked, like you've forgotten something extremely important but can't remember what. It's productive anxiety in pill form. Perfect for people who want to clean their entire house at 3 a.m. while convinced someone's watching them through the windows. The high, if you can even call it that, is uncomfortable and edgy. There's no euphoria, no relaxation, just pure stimulation with a side of paranoia. Users describe feeling wired, twitchy, and unable to sit still. Your jaw clenches involuntarily. You can't stop fidgeting. Every sound makes you jump. It's like your nervous system is permanently stuck in fight or flight mode, except there's nothing to fight and nowhere to flee except around your living room in increasingly erratic circles, while organising things that don't need organising. The real danger, beyond the obvious cardiovascular stress of flooding your system with stimulants, is that pseudoephedrine abuse often serves as a gateway to actual methamphetamine. People start with the pills because they're legal and accessible, discover they enjoy the speedy feeling despite the side effects, and eventually graduate to the real thing when pills stop cutting it. It's like starting with kiddie roller coasters and ending up on a terrifying carnival ride with no safety inspections and a concerning number of missing bolts. And then there's the crowd that buys these pills specifically to cook them into meth, which is where things get truly dystopian. The process involves pseudoephedrine, lithium batteries, drain cleaner, and a shocking disregard for basic safety protocols. People blow themselves up regularly attempting this in motel rooms, basements, and the backs of moving vehicles. The resulting product is toxic, inconsistent, and frequently contaminated with whatever chemicals happened to be lying around when the cook started feeling creative. But it's cheaper than buying finished meth, so people keep trying despite the explosion risk. Law enforcement has responded by making pseudoephedrine increasingly difficult to obtain in bulk. Some states require prescriptions now, others limit how much you can buy per month. There are apps that track your purchases across different stores. It's pharmaceutical surveillance, and it's only partially effective because determined people, will always find a way to obtain what they need, whether that means sending multiple people to different pharmacies, doctor shopping, or just stealing it outright. The absurdity is that we're treating cold medicine like it's a controlled substance because people decided to turn it into actual controlled substances. A box of pills designed to help you breathe now requires you to surrender your privacy and submit to monitoring, all because somewhere along the way someone figured out that chemistry can turn anything into anything else if you're willing to ignore safety, legality, and basic human decency. For $10 to $20 and a scan of your driver's license, you can experience the joy of pharmaceutical surveillance capitalism while your sinuses clear and your heart rate climbs to concerning levels. Progress. Kratom occupies a strange legal grey area, sold openly in smoke shops and gas stations as an herbal supplement while the DEA side-eyes it suspiciously. It comes from the leaves of a Southeast Asian tree, and depending on the dose, it can act as either a stimulant or a sedative, which sounds convenient until you realise consistency is a myth. A single dose costs about as much as a lunch, and regular users describe it as opioid light, all the addiction potential with none of the glamour. The Kratom phenomenon is fascinating because it exists in regulatory limbo. It's not federally illegal, which means gas stations can sell it right next to energy drinks and beef jerky. But it's also not FDA approved, which means nobody's regulating quality, potency, or whether the package actually contains what it claims. You're buying plant material from Southeast Asia that's been ground into powder, shipped across oceans, packaged by companies with names like Happy Hippo or Remarkable Herbs, and sold to you by a teenager working the counter who absolutely does not know or care what it does. The effects vary wildly depending on dosage, strain, and individual body chemistry. Low doses supposedly provide stimulation and focus. Users report feeling energized, social and motivated like coffee, but earthier and with more nausea. Higher doses produce sedation and pain relief, with effects that mimic mild opioids, relaxation, contentment, and a gentle numbing of both physical and emotional discomfort. It sounds perfect for people seeking something between caffeine and Vicodin, except that the line between stimulating and sedating is blurry, inconsistent, and varies from batch to batch. Kratom enthusiasts will tell you it's a miracle plant, a natural alternative to pharmaceuticals, something humans have used safely for centuries in its native habitat. And sure, that's technically true. In Thailand and Malaysia, people chewed kratom leaves while working manual labour jobs, using it the way we use coffee. But there's a massive difference between chewing fresh leaves occasionally and downing concentrated powder by the spoonful multiple times daily, because you're chasing pain relief or trying to wean yourself off actual opioids. Because here's the dirty secret kratom advocates don't emphasize: it's addictive. The alkaloids in kratom bind to opioid receptors in your brain, and when you do that repeatedly, your brain adapts. Tolerance develops, dependence follows. People who use kratom daily report withdrawal symptoms when they stop anxiety, irritability, muscle aches, insomnia, and intense cravings. It's not heroin-level withdrawal, but it's absolutely real and absolutely miserable. You thought you were avoiding addiction by using a natural substance, but chemistry doesn't care about marketing language. The quality control issue is perhaps the most concerning aspect. Because kratom isn't regulated, you have no idea what's actually in that bag. Some products are contaminated with heavy metals, some are cut with other substances, some are just ground up plant matter that may or may not contain active alkaloids. Testing by independent laboratories has found everything from salmonella to synthetic opioids mixed into kratom products. You're trusting that the company whose product you bought at a gas station next to synthetic urine and CBD gummies is following good manufacturing practices. That trust may be misplaced. The typical user demographic falls into two camps. People seeking pain relief who can't afford or access prescription medications, and former opioid users trying to manage withdrawal or avoid relapse. Both groups are vulnerable, desperate for relief, and likely to overlook red flags because Kratom offers something they desperately need. It's harm reduction for some, harm introduction for others, and the lack of regulation means nobody's keeping track of which is which. Prices vary dramatically depending on where you buy it. Gas stations charge premium prices for small quantities, $15 to $30 for a dose or two. Online vendors offer bulk discounts that bring the per-dose cost down significantly, which is great for your wallet and terrible for your consumption patterns because suddenly it's cheap enough to use daily without thinking about the financial consequences. And daily use is where problems begin because that's when your brain chemistry starts adapting and dependence quietly sets in. So you're paying lunch money for a substance that might energize you, might sedate you, might relieve your pain, or might just make you nauseous while providing none of the benefits. It's legal, unregulated, inconsistently dosed, and potentially addictive. It's being marketed as a safe natural alternative, while the FDA issues warnings about contamination and overdose deaths. It's the supplement industry's answer to opioids, and like most things the supplement industry produces, it exists in a regulatory void, where the only guarantee is that someone's making money off your desperation. Tramadol is the opioid nobody respects. It's what doctors prescribe when they think you're in pain but don't trust you enough for the real stuff. On the street, it's cheap, abundant, and thoroughly underwhelming. The decaf coffee of painkillers. A full prescription bottle might cost $20 to $40, and users take handfuls at once, chasing a high that never quite arrives, just a vague wooziness and the distinct possibility of a seizure. In the hierarchy of prescription opioids, Tramadol sits at the bottom, looking up at its more glamorous cousins, oxycodone, hydrocodone, morphine, with envy and resentment. It was initially developed as a safer alternative to traditional opioids, something with less abuse potential that could still manage moderate pain. The pharmaceutical industry marketed it as non-addictive, which was a lie so brazen that it's almost impressive. Sure, Tramadol is weaker than other opioids milligram for milligram, but that just means people take more of it, which doesn't actually solve the addiction problem so much as rebrand it. The mechanism is unusual. Tramadol works partly as an opioid and partly as an SNRI, a serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor, like certain antidepressants. This dual action makes it unpredictable. Some people experience mild pain relief and a subtle mood lift. Others feel dizzy, nauseous, and vaguely disconnected from reality without any of the euphoria that makes opioids attractive. It's like your brain can't decide whether you've taken a painkiller or an antidepressant. So it splits the difference and delivers a confused, unsatisfying high that mostly just makes you sleepy and slightly itchy. The high from Tramadol, when it exists at all, is described as warm and hazy but ultimately disappointing. There's no rush, no intense euphoria, just a gentle blunting of both physical and emotional discomfort. It's pain relief with a side of mild contentment, which would be fine if that's what people were seeking, but recreational users want more, so they take double doses, triple doses, handfuls of pills hoping to break through into actual euphoria. And sometimes they succeed, but more often they just end up nauseous, confused, and at risk for seizures. Oh yes, the seizures. That's Tramadol's special party trick because of its effect on serotonin. Taking too much dramatically increases seizure risk. People pop 6 or 8 pills expecting a nice warm opiate glow, and instead wake up on the floor with a bitten tongue and no memory of the last 15 minutes. It's harm reduction in reverse. You thought you were taking a safer opioid, but you've actually introduced an entirely new category of danger that traditional opioids don't carry. The street market for Tramadol is robust but underwhelming. Dealers sell bottles cheap because demand is low. If someone can access real opioids, they're not buying Tramadol. This is the drug of last resort for people whose tolerance isn't developed yet, or whose options are limited by money, availability, or probation. Officers who test for stronger substances. A full prescription might cost $20 to $40 from someone who got it legitimately and decided to offload it, which is cheaper than a night at the movies and significantly less entertaining. Medical professionals prescribe it, liberally precisely because it's viewed as less dangerous than alternatives. Patients complain of pain. Doctors want to help but also fear contributing to the opioid crisis, so they prescribe Tramadol as a compromise. It's the "at least I'm doing something" medication, the pharmaceutical equivalent of thoughts and prayers. And for people with legitimate pain, it sometimes works adequately, providing enough relief to function without inducing the kind of euphoria that spirals into addiction. But here's the problem. Tramadol is absolutely addictive, just less immediately gratifying than its stronger cousins. People take it daily for pain, develop dependence, and discover that stopping produces withdrawal symptoms, anxiety, insomnia, sweating, and a return of pain that feels worse than it ever was originally. The pharmaceutical industry's promise of a safer opioid turned out to be marketing fiction. You can absolutely get addicted to Tramadol. It just takes longer and feels less exciting along the way. The ultimate indignity is that Tramadol isn't even a controlled substance in many jurisdictions, which means it's barely regulated despite being demonstrably addictive and dangerous in high doses. You can order it online from sketchy pharmacies, buy it from street dealers without much scrutiny, or doctor shop your way to multiple prescriptions without triggering the same alarm bells that real opioids would. It exists in regulatory twilight, dangerous enough to cause harm but not respected enough to warrant serious oversight. For $20 to $40, you can experience the disappointment of an opioid that doesn't quite work, mixed with the seizure risk of taking too much while chasing a high that probably won't materialize. It's the participation trophy of drug experiences you tried. Nobody's particularly impressed, and you might get hurt anyway. Generic benzodiazepines like diazepam or lorazepam are the pharmaceutical industry's answer to anxiety, panic, and the general horror of existing in modern society. They're also wildly addictive, frequently prescribed, and ridiculously easy to obtain if you know which doctor to see. A month's supply costs about as much as a nice dinner, and on the street they're traded like currency among people who just want their brains to stop screaming for a few hours. Benzodiazepines are wonderfully effective at what they do, which is essentially turning down the volume on your central nervous system. Feeling anxious? Take a Xanax. Can't sleep? Pop an Ativan. Panic attack? Valium's got you covered. They work quickly, efficiently, and with a reliability that makes them incredibly popular among doctors who want to help patients, and patients who desperately need help. The problem is that the same qualities that make them effective also make them dangerous. They're fast-acting, powerfully calming, and your body adapts to them rapidly. The generic versions, diazepam, lorazepam, alprazolam, clonazepam, are functionally identical to their brand name counterparts but cost significantly less. A month's prescription might run $30 to $50 with insurance, which seems reasonable until you realize you're paying for chemical dependency in convenient pill form. And because they're generic, doctors prescribe them freely, insurance covers them readily, and pharmacies stock them abundantly. The infrastructure supporting benzodiazepine use is robust, efficient, and completely normalized despite the fact that these drugs are incredibly addictive and potentially life-threatening to stop using abruptly. The high, if you want to call it that, is subtle. Benzos don't produce euphoria in the traditional sense. They produce absence. Absence of anxiety, absence of fear, absence of the constant mental chatter that plagues modern consciousness. For people with anxiety disorders, this absence is revelatory. Suddenly the world isn't terrifying, social situations are manageable, and panic doesn't ambush you at random moments. It's peace, pharmaceutical peace, and after years of suffering it feels like a miracle. But recreational users chase a different effect. Combined with alcohol, which is incredibly dangerous but also incredibly common, benzos produce a sloppy, uninhibited intoxication, where consequences seem distant and decision-making becomes optional. You're not drunk exactly, but you're not sober either. You're floating through interactions with lowered inhibitions and impaired judgment, which is great until you wake up the next day with no memory of the previous 12 hours and a phone full of texts you definitely shouldn't have sent. The addiction profile is insidious. Unlike opioids, which produce obvious euphoria and clear withdrawal symptoms, benzos seduce slowly. You take them as prescribed for anxiety. They work beautifully. Your anxiety disappears. But then if you miss a dose, the anxiety returns, worse than before, with added physical symptoms like tremors and heart palpitations. So you keep taking them. Your doctor keeps prescribing them. Months turn into years. Your brain has completely adapted to their presence, downregulating its own calming neurotransmitters because the pills are doing that job now. And then, if you try to stop, whether by choice or because your prescription runs out, you discover that benzodiazepine withdrawal is one of the few types of withdrawal that can actually kill you. Seizures, hallucinations, severe confusion, and potentially fatal complications await anyone who stops cold turkey after prolonged use. You need medical supervision to taper off, slowly reducing the dose over weeks or months to give your brain time to remember how to regulate itself. It's chemical dependency. At its most literal, your body has forgotten how to function without these pills. The street market is brisk and casual. People sell their extras at parties, trade them with friends, or simply give them away to people having panic attacks. A single pill might cost $1 or $5 depending on strength and availability. Whole prescriptions change hands regularly. The informal benzodiazepine economy is massive, mostly invisible, and absolutely normalized in certain circles where everyone knows someone who has a Xanax prescription and shares liberally. Doctors are becoming more cautious about prescribing benzos, aware now of addiction potential that was downplayed for decades. But millions of people are already dependent, and cutting them off isn't a viable option without comprehensive support for tapering. So the pills keep flowing, prescriptions keep renewing, and people keep discovering that the medication that saved them from anxiety has trapped them in a different kind of prison, one where trying to leave triggers withdrawal so severe it can kill you. For $30 to $50 a month you can purchase chemical peace and physical dependence. You can quiet the chaos in your mind while slowly surrendering your neurochemistry to pills that you now need just to feel normal. You can experience the relief of anxiety melting away while building tolerance that means the dose that worked yesterday won't work tomorrow. It's a bargain, really, depending on how you value the ability to function without external chemical support. The suburban mother's helper comes with a price tag that's both financial and biological, and the bill doesn't arrive until you try to stop paying it. Low-quality ecstasy is what you get when someone's cousin's friend's dealer swears this batch is pure, and you believe him because you're already at the rave and your judgment is clouded by glow sticks and terrible electronic music. These pills cost about as much as concert tickets used to, and they're frequently cut with everything from caffeine to methamphetamine to actual rat poison. The high is unpredictable. Sometimes you feel like hugging strangers, sometimes you just sweat profusely and contemplate mortality while the bass drops. The ecstasy market is a masterclass in consumer deception. Those cute pressed pills with logos Superman, Tesla, Playboy bunnies look like candy and promise specific effects based on their stamp, but the reality is that nobody has any idea what's actually inside. The pill press that made them probably cost a few $100s online. The powder inside could be MDMA, or it could be methadone, or it could be bath salts, or it could be a random combination of stimulants and fillers chosen based on what was cheap and available that week. Testing kits exist, simple chemical reactions that tell you whether your pill contains MDMA or something else. But most people don't use them because that would require planning ahead and admitting that your dealer might be lying. Instead, they rely on the time-honoured tradition of asking around, "Anyone tried these before?" examining the pill's appearance, it looks legit, and making gut decisions based on vibes and desperation. It's pharmacological roulette, but with worse odds and consequences that include jaw clenching, overheating, and accidentally staying awake for 2 days because your ecstasy was actually just meth. When the pill does contain actual MDMA, even then the experience varies wildly based on dose and purity. A good roll on pure MDMA is lovely. Euphoria, empathy, connection, and the sense that everyone at this warehouse rave is your best friend and you love them deeply. Music sounds transcendent. Touching fabric is a spiritual experience. You want to tell strangers your life story and hear theirs. It's chemically induced emotional openness. 3 to 5 hours of your brain flooding itself with serotonin and dopamine while you dance, hug, and experience something close to unconditional love for humanity. Low-quality ecstasy delivers none of that magic. Instead, you get teeth grinding so intense you might crack a molar, profuse sweating that soaks through your clothes, pupils dilated so wide you look possessed, and a speedy, tweaky feeling that's more anxious than euphoric. You're not rolling, you're just uncomfortably stimulated and maybe slightly nauseous. The promised empathy never arrives. You don't want to hug anyone. You want to sit down, drink water, and reconsider your choices. But you can't sit down because whatever's in this pill won't let you, so you pace around the venue wondering when it will end while your jaw does its involuntary clenching routine. The come down is perhaps worse than the high. Real MDMA depletes your serotonin, leaving you emotionally fragile for days afterward, what users call Suicide Tuesday, when the post-weekend depression hits. But low-quality ecstasy combines that serotonin depletion with whatever other stimulants were included, so you're crashed, depressed, and still vaguely wired. You can't sleep, but you're exhausted. You feel hollow but anxious. Your brain chemistry is temporarily destroyed, and you're left wondering if you'll ever feel normal again, while also considering whether it's too soon to roll again next weekend. The market economics are straightforward. MDMA synthesis requires precursor chemicals that are monitored and controlled. Making pure MDMA is expensive and risky, so dealers cut it with cheaper stimulants, caffeine, amphetamine, methylone, piperazines, to stretch supplies and increase profits. They press pills that look identical to pure ones, slap a recognizable logo on them, and rely on the fact that most buyers can't tell the difference until it's already in their system. By then you've paid your $40 to $60, swallowed the pill, and you're committed to whatever the next 4 hours bring. Some pills are dangerous beyond just being impure. They contain substances like PMA or PMMA, which are cheaper to produce than MDMA, but metabolize differently and can cause fatal overheating. People take a normal dose expecting a normal roll, and instead end up in the emergency room with body temperatures of 106 degrees and organs shutting down. It happens regularly enough that festivals now staff medical tents specifically for overdoses, and harm reduction organisations hand out free testing kits and electrolytes while begging people to please just test your drugs before taking them. But testing requires admitting that the magical party pill might be dangerous, and that admission conflicts with the vibe everyone's trying to maintain. So people keep taking mystery pills, keep rolling the dice, and keep hoping that this particular pill from this particular stranger contains what they were promised. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes the difference between the two is the difference between a great night and a trip to the hospital. For $40 to $60, you can play that game, knowing the house always wins and sometimes the prizes just didn't die this time. That's low-quality ecstasy, all of the risk, some of the reward, and absolutely no guarantees that the pill you just swallowed contains any of the compound you were actually trying to consume. Low-quality meth is what happens when someone watched one episode of Breaking Bad and thought, I could do that. Cooked in makeshift labs using pseudoephedrine, battery acid, and pure desperation, this stuff costs about as much as a tank of gas and lasts just about as long. The high is intense, paranoid, and accompanied by the distinct sensation that bugs are crawling under your skin, because your brain is literally being poisoned by amateur chemistry. Let's be clear about what low quality means in the context of methamphetamine. We're talking about a product that's maybe 30 to 40% pure on a good day, cut with everything from MSM, a supplement that crystallizes similarly to meth, to literal drywall powder. It's been cooked in a motel bathroom by someone who failed high school chemistry, using a recipe downloaded from the internet and ingredients purchased at 3 different Walmart stores to avoid suspicion. The resulting crystals look vaguely like the real thing, shiny, translucent, definitely drug-like. But smoking or injecting them is essentially playing Russian roulette with your cardiovascular system. The cook process itself is horrifying. Pseudoephedrine pills get crushed and combined with lithium from batteries, anhydrous ammonia from fertilizer, and various solvents that absolutely should not be inhaled or absorbed through skin. The reaction is exothermic, meaning it produces heat, and if you don't know what you're doing, which most amateur cooks don't, the whole thing can explode, taking your face, your trailer, and possibly your neighbours with it. Local news stations love running stories about meth lab explosions, complete with charred debris and shell-shocked first responders describing the toxic waste site they just entered. When the cook actually succeeds without exploding, you get a product that's contaminated with all the lovely chemicals used to make it. Traces of battery acid, drain cleaner, and camp fuel remain in the final product. Users are smoking or injecting a substance that's part stimulant, part industrial cleaner, part mystery toxin, and they wonder why their teeth fall out and their skin breaks out in sores. It's not just the meth doing damage, it's the entire chemistry set that came along for the ride. The high from low-quality meth is intense but deeply unpleasant for anyone not already dependent. There's a rush of energy. Yes, your heart rate spikes, your pupils dilate, and suddenly you feel awake and alert in ways that seem superhuman. But it's accompanied by jaw-clenching, teeth grinding, profuse sweating, and an underlying anxiety that won't quit. You feel paranoid, jumpy, convinced that every car driving past your house is surveillance. Shadows become threats. Sounds become evidence of conspiracy. Your brain's threat detection system goes into overdrive while your judgment completely abandons you. The famous meth bugs, formication, the sensation of insects crawling under your skin are a direct result of the stimulant's effect on your nervous system. Users pick at their skin compulsively, creating sores that won't heal because they keep picking at them. They scratch and dig, convinced they're removing bugs or parasites, when really they're just destroying their own tissue while high out of their minds. Photos of long-term meth users show faces covered in scabs and scars, physical evidence of psychosis that became habit. Sleep becomes impossible. One hit can keep you awake for 12 to 24 hours, and chronic users stay up for days at a time, hallucinating from sleep deprivation combined with stimulant toxicity. They take on bizarre projects, disassembling electronics, cleaning the same surface for hours, organizing things in patterns only they understand. Productivity without purpose, energy without direction. Then they crash hard, sleeping for days straight, their bodies trying desperately to recover from the chemical assault. The addiction trajectory is brutal and fast. first-time users often report that meth is the best they've ever felt, which is a terrible thing to discover because nothing in life will ever compare. Your brain releases massive amounts of dopamine, far more than any natural reward could trigger, and from that moment forward, everything else is just waiting to use again. Food doesn't taste good anymore. Sex isn't interesting. Hobbies that once brought joy now feel empty. Only meth produces that feeling, and you need more of it every time because tolerance builds rapidly. The demographic is predictably depressing people in rural areas with limited economic opportunities, individuals working multiple jobs who need to stay awake, people escaping trauma or chronic pain who discovered that meth temporarily makes everything bearable. It's not a moral failing. It's a chemical trap dressed up as a solution to problems that society has failed to address. When your life is already difficult and someone offers you a substance that makes you feel powerful, focused, and invincible for a few hours, the calculation starts to make sense, even though the endpoint is always destruction. The street market for low-quality meth is robust because production is relatively easy and demand is high. Dealers cook small batches regularly, sell grams for $50 to $80, and reinvest the profits into more supplies. It's a sustainable business model if you ignore the fact that you're poisoning your community and will likely end up dead or in prison. Law enforcement tries to crack down, but for every lab they bust, 3 more pop up. It's whack-a-mole with chemistry, and the moles are winning. For $50 to $80, you can purchase a gram of contaminated stimulant that will keep you awake for days, convince you that you're being watched, and start you down a path toward physical and psychological destruction from which recovery is possible but unlikely. You'll lose your teeth, your relationships, your job, and possibly your freedom. But for those few hours after smoking or injecting, you'll feel like a god, powerful, focused, invincible. And that feeling is exactly the trap. That's low-quality meth cheap enough to access, powerful enough to destroy everything, and impossible to enjoy once without wanting it forever. Adderall is what happens when society decides we all need to be productive every single second of every single day. Prescribed for ADHD but abused by students, professionals, and anyone who's ever had a deadline, it cost about as much as a textbook when obtained legally. On the street, prices vary wildly depending on whether it's midterms, week, or summer vacation. The high is focused, productive, and followed by a crash that makes you question whether you actually accomplished anything or just rearranged your desk 17 times. The beauty of Adderall from a user's perspective is that it's socially acceptable. You're not taking drugs, you're taking medication for a legitimate medical condition. Never mind that you diagnosed yourself on a Tuesday afternoon after reading WebMD and then carefully curated your symptoms to match ADHD criteria when you finally saw a psychiatrist. Never mind that what you really want is chemical assistance to work longer hours, study harder, and squeeze more productivity from your exhausted brain. The prescription makes it legitimate, and legitimacy makes it easy to rationalize. Getting diagnosed is a game millions have learned to play. You go to a psychiatrist, preferably one known for being understanding about ADHD, and you describe symptoms that could apply to literally anyone: difficulty focusing, trouble completing tasks, mind wandering during boring activities, tendency to procrastinate. These aren't symptoms of a disorder, they're symptoms of being human in a world designed to fragment attention. But frame them correctly, look sufficiently distressed, and you'll walk out with a prescription for amphetamine salts that insurance will partially cover. The medication itself is effective, almost too effective. Students take it before exams, and suddenly they can focus for 6 hours straight, ploughing through material that normally would take days. Professionals take it before big projects and enter a flow state where distractions cease to exist and productivity becomes compulsive. It works undeniably, which is precisely why it's so dangerous. Because once you've experienced that crystalline focus, that sense of mental clarity and drive, normal cognition feels sluggish and inadequate by comparison. The high is subtle, professional, socially sanctioned. There's no euphoria exactly, just a gentle amphetamine push that makes everything interesting and accomplishable. That boring assignment, suddenly fascinating. That tedious work project, engaging and important. Your brain is firing on all cylinders, making connections, generating ideas, and completely ignoring the fact that you haven't eaten in 8 hours and your jaw is clenched tight enough to crack walnuts. You're not high, you're enhanced. You're the person you always thought you could be, if only you could focus properly. But here's the problem. The dose that worked last month doesn't work anymore. Your brain adapts, receptors downregulate, and suddenly you need more to achieve the same effect. So you go back to your psychiatrist, report that your symptoms aren't adequately controlled, and get your dose increased. This cycle repeats until you're taking doses that would make a doctor uncomfortable if they knew how much you'd escalated. But they don't know, because you're seeing multiple doctors, filling prescriptions at different pharmacies, and carefully managing your drug-seeking behavior to avoid obvious red flags. The street market is active year-round, but particularly lucrative during final season. College campuses become pharmaceutical bazaars where kids with prescriptions sell their extras for $5 to $10 per pill. A 30-milligram pill might cost $3 in July and $15 in December. It's supply and demand, textbook economics, applied to controlled substances sold in dorm rooms by entrepreneurial students who've discovered that their ADHD medication is more valuable than any part-time job. Non-prescribed users run into problems quickly. Tolerance develops fast. Sleep becomes difficult or impossible if you take it too late in the day. Appetite disappears. Users lose weight unintentionally, surviving on coffee and vague anxiety, while their bodies slowly deplete essential nutrients. Irritability spikes when the medication wears off. Your baseline mood drops as your brain adjusts to the constant presence of amphetamines, making unmedicated time feel increasingly depressing. And the crash. Oh, the crash. When Adderall wears off, you don't just return to normal, you drop below it. You're exhausted, irritable, unable to focus, and convinced that you can't function without the medication. So you take more, even though it's late and you know you won't sleep. You take more even though you've already exceeded your prescribed dose today. You take more because the alternative, feeling like this, is intolerable. And that's when you realize you're not enhancing your performance anymore. You're just maintaining a baseline that keeps dropping. The long-term effects are concerning but often ignored by users chasing short-term productivity. Cardiovascular stress from chronic stimulant use. Anxiety that becomes baseline rather than occasional. Depression during unmedicated periods. Psychological dependence that makes the idea of functioning without chemical assistance seem impossible. You started taking Adderall to improve your focus. You end up unable to focus at all without it, trapped in a cycle where the medication that was supposed to help you succeed has become the only thing preventing you from failing. Doctors are becoming warier, prescribing more cautiously, requiring more frequent check-ins. But millions of prescriptions are still written annually, and every prescribed bottle represents potential street supply. For $50 to $100 a month, you can access pharmaceutical-grade amphetamines that society views as medicine rather than drugs. You can boost your productivity, sharpen your focus, and slowly teach your brain that it's inadequate without chemical assistance. It's enhancement until it's dependence, and the line between the two is thinner than anyone admits. That's Adderall, the socially acceptable stimulant that turns everyday functioning into a pharmaceutical subscription service with side effects, tolerance, and withdrawal symptoms included free of charge. Magic mushrooms have been humanity's gateway to spiritual enlightenment, terrible decisions and profound realizations about carpet patterns for thousands of years. An eighth ounce costs about as much as a decent dinner, and the experience lasts 4 to 6 hours of either transcendent beauty or psychological horror, depending entirely on your mindset and whether someone remembered to mention you shouldn't look in mirrors. Experienced users describe it as opening your third eye. First-timers describe it as, why is the wall breathing and should I call someone? Psilocybin mushrooms occupy a unique space in drug culture, revered by psychonauts, tolerated by harm reduction advocates, and increasingly studied by scientists who've discovered that, yes, ancient humans were onto something. These aren't party drugs, they're journey drugs. You don't take mushrooms to get lit at a club. You take them to have conversations with your subconscious, confront your mortality, or spend 4 hours convinced that you've discovered the fundamental nature of reality, only to forget it the moment you sober up. The experience begins gently, 30 to 45 minutes after eating the dried mushrooms, which taste exactly as awful. As you'd imagine dried fungus would taste, you start noticing changes. Colours seem brighter, patterns start moving subtly. You feel slightly strange, not quite high, but definitely not sober, and you wonder if maybe you should have eaten less or more or possibly none at all. And then the walls start breathing. That's when you realise you're committed. The psilocybin is converting to psilocin in your body, crossing the blood-brain barrier and binding to serotonin receptors in ways that fundamentally alter your perception. Visual distortions intensify, surfaces ripple and flow, colours separate into spectral components, geometric patterns emerge from nowhere. Close your eyes, and you're treated to a light show of fractals, an impossible architecture generated entirely by your visual cortex having a chemical party. But the visuals are just the surface layer. The real trip happens in your head. Thoughts become fluid, boundaries between ideas dissolve, and you start making connections that seem profound and probably are profound, but you'll never be able to adequately explain to sober people why the relationship between music and mathematics proves that consciousness is fundamental to the universe. Your ego, that persistent sense of being a separate self, starts to soften or disappear entirely. Some people find this liberating. Others find it terrifying. Set and setting matter enormously. Take mushrooms in a comfortable environment with trusted friends, and you're likely to have a beautiful experience of laughter, wonder, and deep bonding. Take them at a party full of strangers while already anxious, and you're setting yourself up for hours of paranoid confusion, while everyone's faces look vaguely sinister, and you can't remember if you locked your car or whether you even drove here. Context is everything, and mushrooms amplify whatever emotional frequency you bring to the experience. The dark side emerges when things go wrong. Bad trips are psychologically harrowing, hours trapped in anxiety loops, convinced that you've permanently broken your brain, that reality will never return to normal, that this feeling will last forever. Time dilates grotesquely. 5 minutes feels like hours. Your thoughts spiral into darkness, and you can't escape because you are your thoughts, and your thoughts are the problem. People report confronting traumatic memories, experiencing temporary psychosis, or simply being overwhelmed by the intensity of existence itself. And then, gradually it ends. The peak lasts 2 to 3 hours, followed by a gentle come down where you're still slightly altered but functional enough to remember that you're a person with a name who lives in a specific place and probably should eat something. The afterglow can be lovely, a sense of peace, connection, and perspective that lingers for days or weeks. Many users report that mushrooms help them process depression, anxiety, or trauma in ways that years of therapy hadn't achieved. The price reflects both legality issues and organic growing limitations. You can't synthesize psilocybin cheaply like you can with LSD. You need to actually grow mushrooms, which requires time, space, and knowledge. An 1/8 ounce costs $80 to $120, depending on supply and your relationship with your dealer. It's expensive enough to be occasional rather than habitual, which is probably for the best because frequent mushroom use leads to rapidly developing tolerance and increasingly diminished returns. Legally, psilocybin remains Schedule 1 in most places, classified alongside heroin as having no medical value and high abuse potential, a categorization so divorced from reality that even the DEA seems embarrassed by it. Recent years have seen movements toward decriminalization and medical research, with cities like Denver and Oregon leading the charge toward treating mushrooms as tools for healing, rather than criminals deserving prosecution. The risk profile is remarkably low for a substance classified as highly dangerous. Mushrooms aren't physically addictive, they don't cause organ damage, and it's essentially impossible to take a lethal dose. The dangers are psychological, bad trips, temporary psychosis in vulnerable individuals, or making terrible decisions while impaired. But compared to alcohol, tobacco, or basically any other recreational substance, mushrooms are remarkably benign. For $80 to $120, you can purchase a chemical key that unlocks parts of your consciousness you didn't know existed. You might meet entities that seem more real than reality. You might cry about beauty for no reason. You might spend 2 hours laughing at your hands. Or you might have a panic attack that feels eternal, while your friends assure you that you're fine and everything is fine, and could you please stop asking whether reality is real? It's a gamble, but it's a gamble that humans have been taking for millennia, seeking transcendence, healing, or just a really interesting Saturday. That's mushrooms' ancient organic consciousness expanding and occasionally terrifying proof that nature invented psychedelics long before humans figured out chemistry. Low-quality cocaine is what you get when your dealer's dealer's dealer decided that 20% pure was close enough. Cut with everything from baby laxatives to laundry detergent, this powder costs about as much as a car payment and delivers a high that's less Wolf of Wall Street and more jittery accountant having a panic attack in a bathroom stall. The euphoria lasts maybe 20 minutes before you're desperately searching for more, which is exactly how dealers like it. Cocaine's journey from South American coca fields to your local party involves so many intermediaries that by the time it reaches street-level dealing, the actual cocaine content has been diluted repeatedly. Each person in the supply chain cuts it a little more, adding levamisole, a deworming agent that bulks up the powder and produces a mild stimulant effect. Phenacetin, a painkiller that mimics cocaine's numbing properties, or simple inert fillers like inositol or mannitol that add weight without adding obvious flavour. What started as relatively pure cocaine hydrochloride in a Colombian lab ends up as a white powder that's maybe 20 to 30% actual drug. The experience of low-quality cocaine is distinctive and disappointing. You snort a line which burns your nasal passages because of whatever cutting agents are present, and within minutes you feel a rush of energy and confidence. Your heart rate increases, your pupils dilate, and you suddenly feel like the most interesting person in the conversation. You talk faster, laugh louder, and think you're being charming when really you're just not letting anyone else speak. This lasts approximately 15 to 25 minutes before crashing hard into restless dissatisfaction. The compulsive redosing is cocaine's signature feature. The high is too brief, the crash too immediate, and the craving too intense to resist doing more. You tell yourself one more line, just to maintain the feeling, but 1 becomes 2 becomes 10, and suddenly you've gone through your entire supply in a few hours while accomplishing nothing except having rapid-fire conversations that seemed profound at the time, but were actually just stimulant-induced rambling about nothing. Physical side effects appear quickly with low-quality stuff. Your nose runs constantly, producing a telltale drip of numbed mucus down the back of your throat that tastes chemical and awful. Your jaw clenches, your hands shake slightly, you sweat even though you're not hot. Your heart pounds in a way that makes you vaguely concerned but not concerned enough to stop doing more lines. Heavy users develop a persistent cough, nosebleeds, and eventually perforated septums, holes in the cartilage separating their nostrils because the cocaine and cutting agents have literally eroded the tissue. The crash is immediate and unpleasant. The moment cocaine wears off, you don't return to baseline. You drop into a dysphoric state of anxiety, irritability, and intense craving. Nothing feels good. Food isn't appealing. Conversation is tedious. You're not just sober, you're uncomfortably aware of your sobriety and desperate to escape it. This feeling drives the compulsive redosing pattern. You're not chasing the initial high anymore, you're fleeing the crash. The demographic spans classes in ways that few drugs do. Cocaine appears in Wall Street bathrooms and dive bar restrooms, at exclusive parties and sketchy house gatherings. It's the drug of people who want to feel successful, powerful and energized, whether they're investment bankers celebrating bonuses or service workers trying to make it through double shifts. The price point, $80 to $150 per gram of low-quality stuff, is accessible enough for occasional use but expensive, enough to drain bank accounts when use becomes regular. Street dealers play games with quality and weight. They'll sell you a gram that's actually 0.7 grams. They'll promise fire or scale, cocaine that's pure when it's anything but. They rely on the fact that most buyers can't assess purity until they've already purchased and used it, and by then you're not getting a refund. Customer service doesn't exist in illegal markets. You get what you get and hope it doesn't kill you. The cutting agents themselves pose serious health risks. Levamisole, commonly used because it's white and has some stimulant properties, can destroy white blood cells, compromising your immune system. Phenacetin is a suspected carcinogen. Some dealers use local anesthetics like lidocaine or benzocaine to mimic cocaine's numbing effect, but these can cause allergic reactions or, in high doses, seizures. You're not just gambling on cocaine's effects. You're gambling on a mystery mix of chemicals that nobody bothered to safety test. Addiction develops insidiously. Unlike opioids, where physical withdrawal is obvious and brutal, cocaine dependence is primarily psychological. You can function without it, technically, but functioning feels grey and pointless. Activities that used to bring joy now seem dull unless you're high. Socializing feels like work unless cocaine makes you chatty. Success doesn't feel like success unless you're celebrating with powder. Your brain has learned that cocaine equals pleasure, and everything else equals not cocaine equals not pleasure. The cost adds up devastatingly fast. A gram lasts a few hours if you're sharing, less if you're not. At $80 to $150 per session, weekend use becomes ruinously expensive. People start cutting corners elsewhere, skipping meals, ignoring bills, borrowing money they can't repay, because the craving overrides practical concerns. They tell themselves they can quit any time, and technically they're right. They just don't want to face a world without chemical enhancement. For $80 to $150, you can purchase a gram of powder that's been cut repeatedly, with whatever was cheap and available, transported across continents in someone's body cavity, and sold to you by a stranger who may or may not have mixed in something actually dangerous. You'll feel great for 20 minutes, chase that feeling for hours, accomplish nothing, and wake up the next day depleted, anxious, and possibly questioning your life choices. But probably you'll just think about when you can get more, because that's what cocaine does best. Convert money into fleeting confidence and permanent wanting. That's low-quality coke expensive, disappointing, and precisely addictive enough to keep you coming back even though you know better. LSD is the drug that promised to expand consciousness, and mostly just made people stare at their hands for 8 hours, wondering if time is real. A 10 strip costs about as much as concert tickets, and each tiny square of paper contains enough to send you on a journey through dimensions you didn't know existed, and probably didn't need to discover. The high is long, intense, and occasionally features conversations with entities that may or may not be figments of your overstimulated imagination. Lysergic acid diethylamide, mercifully shortened to LSD, was discovered accidentally in 1938 by a chemist looking for respiratory and circulatory stimulants. Albert Hofmann synthesized it, set it aside as uninteresting, then accidentally absorbed some through his skin 5 years later and took the world's first acid trip, riding his bicycle home while reality disintegrated around him. His bicycle ride became legendary in psychedelic culture, celebrated annually as Bicycle Day by people who appreciate the poetry of discovering consciousness, shattering drugs by accident. The substance itself is remarkably potent. An active dose is measured in micrograms, millionths of a gram. A standard hit contains about 100 micrograms, enough to completely alter perception for 8 to 12 hours. That potency means LSD is almost always sold on blotter paper, small squares decorated with artwork and soaked in liquid LSD solution. You're buying art that gets you high, which has a certain aesthetic appeal until you remember you're about to spend half a day unable to determine whether your thoughts are profound or just drug-induced nonsense. The come-up is gradual and vaguely ominous. 30 to 60 minutes after placing that tiny paper square on your tongue, you start noticing changes. Colours seem richer. Patterns in wallpaper or carpet start moving subtly. You feel a slight physical sensation, a gentle body load, some describe it, and then suddenly you're aware that you're not sober and won't be for a very long time. This realization can trigger anxiety or excitement depending on your mindset. Either way, you're committed now. The cosmic roller coaster has left the station, and there's no exit until it decides to release you. At the peak, reality becomes negotiable. Visual distortions intensify, objects breathe, surfaces ripple like water, colours separate into spectrums. Close your eyes, and you're presented with complex geometric patterns, mandalas that assemble and disassemble themselves, entire landscapes generated from nowhere. Open them, and the room you're in has become alien, familiar objects transformed into incomprehensible forms. You look at your friend's face and suddenly you can see every ancestor they've descended from layered transparently over their features. But visuals are just the appetizer. The real LSD experience happens in your mind. Thoughts become fluid, branching in multiple directions simultaneously. You make connections between disparate concepts, suddenly understanding how music and mathematics are the same thing, or why the pattern of traffic resembles cellular mitosis, or what it would feel like to be a tree. These insights seem profound and universe-shattering in the moment. Later, when you're sober, you'll struggle to articulate why you spent 20 minutes crying about the concept of doors. Time distortion is profound and occasionally distressing. 5 minutes can feel like hours. An entire afternoon can pass in what seems like minutes. You lose track of when things happened, whether that conversation occurred 5 minutes ago or 5 hours ago, whether you've been tripping for 2 hours or 8. This temporal confusion can be playful or nightmarish depending on your mental state. If you're enjoying yourself, it's a gift, more time to explore this altered state. If you're anxious, it's torture, the feeling that this will never end. Ego dissolution happens at higher doses or in susceptible individuals. The boundaries that define you as separate from everything else start breaking down. You might experience unity with the universe, a sense of being part of something vastly larger than your individual self. This can be transcendent, a spiritual awakening, a glimpse of enlightenment, the best experience of your life. Or it can be terrifying, the self you've built dissolving into nothing, leaving you adrift in an incomprehensible universe with no anchor to hold on to. Same chemical, different interpretations, vastly different experiences. Bad trips are psychologically brutal. Hours trapped in anxiety loops where the same fearful thoughts circle endlessly. Paranoia that everyone can tell you're on drugs and they're judging you. Visual distortions that turn threatening or demonic. The conviction that you've permanently damaged your brain and will never return to normal. Time stretches impossibly. What's actually been 30 minutes feels like days. You desperately want to be sober, but there's no off switch, no way to end the experience early. You simply have to endure, riding it out while trying to remember that this is temporary, even though every fibre of your being insists it's permanent. The lack of physical toxicity is remarkable. LSD isn't hard on your organs, doesn't damage tissue, and essentially can't be overdosed in a lethal sense. People have taken hundreds of times the normal dose and, while having incomprehensibly intense experiences, survived without physical harm. The dangers are psychological and behavioural bad trips, triggering latent mental illness in vulnerable individuals or making dangerously poor decisions while impaired. You're not going to die from LSD itself, but you might have a psychotic break, jump out a window because you think you can fly, or simply traumatise yourself so thoroughly that you avoid psychedelics for the rest of your life. The price reflects manufacturing complexity and risk. LSD synthesis requires significant chemistry knowledge, specialised precursors, and laboratory equipment. The risk of manufacturing is high, penalties for production are severe. But the yield from a successful synthesis is enormous. A single gram contains 10,000 doses. So despite the difficulty and danger of production, individual doses remain relatively affordable. A 10-strip costs $100 to $150, working out to $10 to $15 per trip, remarkably cheap for 8 to 12 hours of consciousness alteration. Cultural baggage accompanies LSD heavily. It's associated with the 1960s counterculture, with Timothy Leary's turn on, tune in, drop out philosophy, with hippies and communes and the general chaos of that era. This association makes it seem either appealingly rebellious or dangerously irresponsible depending on your perspective. Modern psychedelic culture has attempted to rebrand LSD as a tool for creativity, therapy, and spiritual exploration, which is arguably what it was before it became illegal. For $100 to $150, you can purchase 10 tickets to parallel dimensions, 10 opportunities to completely reconfigure your perception of reality, or 10 gambles on whether your brain will interpret the experience as enlightenment or emergency. You'll see impossible colours, think impossible thoughts, and possibly encounter the fundamental nature of consciousness, or possibly just have a really weird Saturday where you couldn't stop laughing at the concept of furniture. It's the psychedelic lottery. Sometimes you win profound insights, sometimes you just win profound confusion, and occasionally you win 8 hours of wondering why you voluntarily did this to yourself. That's LSD, ancient chemistry, modern mysteries, and the persistent question of whether you discovered deep truths or just learned that your brain does weird things when you poison it with ergot alkaloids. GHB occupies the unfortunate position of being both a party drug and a notorious date rape drug, which means it comes with a side of moral horror alongside the high. A bottle costs about as much as a weekend grocery run, and the effects range from euphoric disinhibition to complete unconsciousness, often with very little warning between the two states. It's the drug equivalent of playing Russian roulette with your central nervous system while loud music plays in the background. Gamma-hydroxybutyrate, GHB, for those who don't want to tie their tongues in knots, exists in a weird pharmacological space. At low doses, it's a sedative and euphoriant, producing effects similar to alcohol but cleaner, more controlled, and without the hangover. At slightly higher doses, it's an amnestic that makes memory formation impossible. At doses just barely above that, it's a complete anesthetic that renders you unconscious and potentially stops your breathing. The margin between fun night out and medical emergency is terrifyingly narrow, and there's no way to accurately measure doses when you're buying from a stranger in a nightclub bathroom. The substance itself is a clear, odourless, slightly salty liquid that looks like water and can be easily slipped into drinks, hence its notorious reputation as a date rape drug. This association has made GHB deeply stigmatised, and rightfully so. Its use in sexual assault is well documented and horrifying, but setting aside that particular evil, GHB also has a recreational user base that takes it voluntarily, seeking its particular combination of euphoria, reduced inhibitions and enhanced sensory experiences, particularly touch and music. The high comes on fast within 15 to 30 minutes and hits hard. Users describe a wave of warmth and well-being washing over them, social anxiety evaporating, and a general sense that everything is wonderful and everyone is beautiful. It's similar to alcohol intoxication, but without the sloppiness, the aggression, or the next-day misery. Music sounds richer, physical sensations intensify, and dancing feels almost transcendent. For these reasons, GHB became popular in the club and rave scenes, where its effects complement the environment perfectly. But here's where things get dangerous. The dose-response curve for GHB is steep and unpredictable. What works perfectly one night might be too much the next, because factors like food intake, alcohol consumption, and individual metabolism dramatically affect how GHB is processed. You take the same amount you took last weekend, but this time you haven't eaten much, and suddenly instead of euphoria, you're unconscious on a bathroom floor while strangers decide whether to call an ambulance or just drag you outside and hope you wake up. The G-hole, the state of deep sedation or unconsciousness from too much GHB, is genuinely dangerous. People stop responding to stimuli, their breathing becomes shallow and irregular, and they can choke on their own vomit while unconscious. Emergency rooms see GHB overdoses regularly, and paramedics can't always distinguish between GHB overdose and other causes of unconsciousness without toxicology tests. If you're at a club and someone near you suddenly slumps over unresponsive, GHB is a likely culprit, and that person needs immediate medical attention. Mixing GHB with alcohol, which many people do because they're already drinking when someone offers them a capful of G, is especially dangerous. Both substances depress the central nervous system, and their effects multiply rather than add. You're not slightly more intoxicated, you're potentially fatally sedated. Respiratory depression intensifies, and the risk of aspiration while unconscious skyrockets. Emergency medical personnel will tell you that GHB and alcohol overdoses are among the scariest they encounter because patients can go from conscious to comatose in minutes. The addiction potential is severe and under-discussed. Because GHB affects GABA receptors, the same system that benzodiazepines and alcohol target, physical dependence develops with regular use. Chronic users take multiple doses throughout the day and night, setting alarms every few hours even while sleeping to maintain blood levels and avoid withdrawal. And GHB withdrawal is brutal, severe anxiety, tremors, insomnia, hallucinations, and potentially life-threatening seizures. It's one of the few drug withdrawals that can actually kill you if not properly managed medically. The legal status varies by jurisdiction, but generally GHB is Schedule I or its equivalent, illegal to possess without prescription, though it does have legitimate medical uses for narcolepsy under the brand name Xyrem. The precursors, GBL, gamma-butyrolactone, and 1,4-BD, 1,4-butanediol, are sometimes legal and are converted to GHB in the body. So people buy GHB alternative products that are technically legal but produce identical effects once metabolized. Street GHB comes in small bottles, often poorly labelled, with concentrations that vary wildly. You might buy a bottle where one capful is a dose, or you might buy one where one capful is 4 doses, and there's no way to know until you've taken it. Dealers aren't exactly providing certificates of analysis. This inconsistency means every use is a gamble. You're trusting that the person who mixed this batch knew what they were doing and labelled it accurately, which is a lot of trust to place in the illegal drug market. The price, $100 to $200 per bottle, buys you somewhere between 10 and 30 doses, depending on concentration and individual tolerance. That works out to fairly cheap per use, which contributes to its popularity despite the risks. People rationalise that it's less expensive than a night of drinking, produces a better high, and doesn't cause hangovers. All technically true, right up until you miscalculate the dose and wake up in a hospital with no memory of the previous 6 hours. For $100 to $200, you can purchase a bottle of clear liquid that might give you euphoric nights of dancing and connection, or might render you unconscious and vulnerable, or might stop your breathing entirely if you dose wrong or mix with alcohol. You're playing pharmacological roulette with a substance that has a narrow therapeutic window and potentially fatal consequences. And all of this is overlaid with the knowledge that this same substance is used to facilitate sexual assault, which adds a layer of moral complexity that's impossible to fully separate from the chemistry. That's GHB powerful, dangerous, unpredictable, and carrying baggage that makes even discussing it feel uncomfortable. It's a drug that might give you the best night of your life or might be the last thing you remember before waking up in an ambulance, and the difference between those outcomes is measured in milliliters you probably can't accurately measure. Bath salts burst onto the scene in the 2010s with news stories about people eating faces and fighting police officers while naked, which is really not the marketing strategy most drugs aspire to. These synthetic stimulants cost about as much as a nice pair of shoes and deliver a high that's been described as meth's angrier, more paranoid cousin. Users report feeling invincible, superhuman, and deeply convinced that everyone is plotting against them, which explains the face-eating incident. The term bath salts is deliberately misleading. These aren't actually bath products, but synthetic cathinones sold under that label to skirt drug laws. The most common compounds are mephedrone, methylone, and MDPV, methylenedioxypyrovalerone, though the specific chemicals vary as manufacturers tweak formulas to stay ahead of legislation. They were sold openly in gas stations and smoke shops, packaged in colourful pouches labelled "not for human consumption," fooling absolutely nobody about their intended use. The effects are intensely stimulating and deeply unpleasant for anyone not specifically seeking that kind of chaos. Within minutes of use, whether snorted, swallowed or injected, users experience a massive rush of energy accompanied by euphoria, heightened alertness, and intense sensory stimulation. But unlike cleaner stimulants, bath salts produce pronounced psychological side effects from the start: paranoia, agitation, and aggressive behaviour. You don't feel good exactly. You feel wired, threatening, and convinced that something terrible is about to happen. The Miami face-eating incident in 2012 became the defining media moment for bath salts, even though toxicology later revealed the attacker hadn't actually used them. But the damage was done. Bath salts were now synonymous with zombie-like violence and psychotic breaks. And while that specific case was misattributed, there were plenty of legitimate incidents, people stripping naked and running through neighbourhoods, attacking police officers with superhuman strength, injuring themselves without feeling pain, and experiencing complete psychotic breaks requiring multiple officers to restrain them. The stimulation is so intense that users often can't sit still, leading to compulsive movement, repetitive behaviors, and sometimes violent outbursts directed at perceived threats that don't exist. Heart rate and blood pressure spike to dangerous levels. Body temperature rises, sometimes to the point of causing organ damage. Users report feeling superhuman, impervious to pain, stronger than normal, capable of anything. This sensation of invincibility combines with paranoia to create a genuinely dangerous mental state where attacking perceived enemies seems both necessary and achievable. Sleep becomes impossible. Users stay awake for days, and the sleep deprivation compounds the drug's inherent psychological effects. Hallucinations develop: visual, auditory, tactile. People report seeing shadow figures, hearing voices plotting against them, feeling bugs crawling on or under their skin. The line between stimulant effects and stimulant-induced psychosis blurs completely, and users can't distinguish reality from drug-induced delusions. The crash is catastrophic. After hours or days of intense stimulation, users finally come down into a state of complete exhaustion, mixed with profound depression. The brain's dopamine stores are depleted, leaving users unable to experience pleasure, motivation, or hope. Suicidal ideation is common during the crash phase. The only relief seems to be using more bath salts, which restarts the cycle of stimulation, paranoia, and eventual crushing depression. Physical side effects are severe and sometimes permanent. Kidney damage from hypothermia and rhabdomyolysis, the breakdown of muscle tissue that floods the bloodstream with harmful proteins, cardiovascular damage from hours of elevated heart rate and blood pressure, cognitive impairment that persists long after use stops. Some users develop movement disorders or persistent psychotic symptoms that require antipsychotic medication to manage. The legal response was swift and chaotic. Governments banned specific compounds, so manufacturers slightly modified the molecular structure and released new versions under different names. It became a game of chemical whack-a-mole, with legislators always 6 months behind the latest formulation. Eventually, broad analogue laws were passed that banned entire chemical families, making it harder to circumvent by tweaking molecules. But black market production simply moved entirely underground. The demographics skewed toward young people seeking legal highs and individuals with limited access to traditional stimulants. The packaging was deliberately aimed at teenagers, colourful, playful, available at stores they could enter legally. The results were tragic emergency rooms filled with adolescents experiencing psychotic breaks, families destroyed by addiction to substances they'd never heard of, and a generation learning that legal doesn't mean safe. The price, $150 to $250 per gram, was high enough to prevent casual daily use, but accessible enough for weekend experimentation. A gram contained multiple doses, depending on tolerance and route of administration. Users quickly discovered that the initial euphoria disappeared with tolerance, while the paranoia and agitation remained, creating a cycle where they were chasing a high that no longer existed while experiencing all the negative effects. For $150 to $250, you can purchase a gram of powder that was specifically engineered to circumvent drug laws, probably synthesized in a clandestine laboratory with questionable quality control and designed to mimic the effects of established stimulants while being technically distinct enough to avoid immediate prohibition. You'll feel powerful, paranoid, and possibly convinced that you need to fight everyone around you. You might stay awake for days. You might develop psychosis that persists after the drug wears off. You might end up restrained in a hospital, while medical staff try to figure out which of the hundreds of possible synthetic cathinons you've taken, so they can treat you appropriately. That's bath salts, the designer drug disaster that taught everyone that synthetic doesn't mean better, legal doesn't mean safe, and sometimes the street drugs you know are less dangerous than the laboratory chemicals you don't. It's chemistry gone wrong in pursuit of profit, packaged in pretty colours and sold to people who trusted that something available at a gas station couldn't possibly destroy their lives this thoroughly. OxyContin is the drug that launched 1,000 addiction crises and somehow remained legal for decades while destroying communities across America. A bottle of these time-release opioid pills cost about as much as car insurance, and on the street they're sold individually for premium prices to people who started with a legitimate prescription and ended up discovering that escaping pain is addictive in more ways than one. The story of OxyContin is the story of pharmaceutical marketing meeting American pain culture and producing catastrophe. Purdue Pharma introduced OxyContin in 1996, marketing it aggressively as a breakthrough in pain management, a time-release formulation that provided 12 hours of relief, reducing the need for frequent dosing. Sales representatives visited doctors with misleading information about addiction risk, and Purdue claimed that the time-release mechanism made OxyContin less addictive than other opioids. This was a lie, and Purdue knew it was a lie, but it was a profitable lie that made them billions while communities burned. Doctors, genuinely wanting to help patients suffering from chronic pain, and told by pharmaceutical representatives that this new drug was safe and effective, began prescribing OxyContin liberally. Post-surgical pain, chronic back pain, arthritis, fibromyalgia, OxyContin was positioned as the solution. Patients took it as prescribed and discovered something wonderful. It didn't just stop physical pain, it stopped emotional pain too. Anxiety, depression, trauma, all of it faded into a warm, comfortable haze. For people who had suffered for years, this relief felt like salvation. The time-release mechanism was supposed to prevent abuse by slowly releasing oxycodone over 12 hours. But users quickly discovered that crushing the pills defeated the time release, allowing them to snort or inject the entire dose at once for an immediate, intense high. The same pharmaceutical innovation meant to prevent abuse became the delivery system for it. People who started taking OxyContin for legitimate pain found themselves crushing pills, chasing the rush, and spiraling into addiction before they understood what was happening. The high from oxycodone is classic opioid euphoria, warm, peaceful, content. Pain disappears, both physical and psychological. Anxiety evaporates. The edges of the world soften. You feel wrapped in chemical comfort, safe and disconnected from everything that usually troubles you. It's not energizing or psychedelic or disorienting. It's simply the absence of suffering, which for many people is the most profound high imaginable. And once you've experienced that complete relief, the world without it seems unbearably harsh by comparison. Tolerance develops with frightening speed. The dose that worked last month doesn't work this month. You need more pills, more frequently, to achieve the same effect. Doctors, recognizing signs of dependence, might refuse to increase prescriptions or cut patients off entirely. This is when people turn to the street market, buying pills from dealers, paying premium prices, and often transitioning to heroin when pills become too expensive or unavailable. The trajectory is predictable and tragic: prescription, to dependence to street pills, to heroin, to fentanyl, to overdose. The street market for OxyContin exploded as demand outpaced legitimate supply. Pills that cost patients a few dollars with insurance were being sold for $1 per milligram. An 80-milligram OxyContin could fetch $80 on the street. Entire communities organized around pill distribution. Pill mills opened where corrupt doctors prescribed opioids to anyone willing to pay. People doctor shopped, visiting multiple physicians to accumulate prescriptions. Pharmacies were robbed. Prescription pads were stolen. The infrastructure of addiction became embedded in American healthcare. Withdrawal from oxycodone is physically brutal and psychologically devastating. Body aches that feel like your bones are breaking, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, insomnia despite exhaustion, restless legs that won't let you stay still, cold sweats and hot flashes, intense anxiety and depression, and worst of all, cravings so powerful that they override every rational thought, every promise you made to yourself, every reason you have to quit. Withdrawal doesn't kill you, unlike alcohol or benzodiazepine withdrawal, but it makes you wish it would. The reformulation of OxyContin in 2010, making it harder to crush and abuse, didn't solve the problem. It just pushed users toward alternatives. Heroin use spiked as people dependent on pills found them harder to abuse and too expensive to maintain habits. The opioid crisis didn't end. It evolved, mutating from a prescription drug problem into a street drug catastrophe as heroin flooded markets and fentanyl contamination turned every dose into a potentially fatal gamble. Communities were devastated, particularly rural and post-industrial areas where economic hardship made the escape opioids offered particularly appealing. Families were destroyed, children ended up in foster care, entire workforces were decimated. The overdose death toll climbed year after year, surpassing car accidents and gun violence as a leading cause of death for Americans under 50. And through it all, Purdue Pharma continued profiting until finally, in 2019, the company filed for bankruptcy amid thousands of lawsuits, though members of the Sackler family who owned it managed to protect their billions. The price of a bottle, $150 to $300, represents both the street value of diverted prescriptions and the cost of maintaining dependence. A bottle might contain 30 to 90 pills depending on prescription strength and quantity. For someone dependent, that bottle represents relief from withdrawal, a week or two of functionality, or a few days of actually feeling good rather than just not sick. For someone selling them, it represents significant profit margins selling individually to desperate buyers. For $150 to $300, you can purchase a bottle of pills that were designed to help but destroy instead, marketed as safe but proved deadly, prescribed by doctors who trusted pharmaceutical companies that lied to them. You can experience relief so profound that everything else seems colourless without it. You can discover that the same medicine that saved you from pain has trapped you in dependence. You can join millions of others in understanding that the opioid crisis wasn't about moral failing or lack of willpower. It was about corporate greed meeting human suffering and producing industrial-scale addiction. That's OxyContin, the legal drug that broke America, one prescription at a time, while the people who profited most faced minimal consequences, and communities are still counting the dead. Ketamine started as a horse, tranquilizer, and somehow ended up in nightclub bathrooms worldwide, which tells you everything you need to know about humanity's relationship with recreational substances. A gram costs about as much as a gym membership, and the high is described as dissociative, dreamy, and occasionally featuring something users call the K-hole, a state of complete detachment from reality that sounds mystical, until you're lying on a bathroom floor unable to remember your own name. The drug was developed in 1962 as an anesthetic for surgery and veterinary medicine, safer than PCP, which it was designed to replace, though safer than PCP is a low bar to clear. Ketamine produces a unique state called dissociative anesthesia, where patients appear conscious, eyes open, reflexes intact, but are completely disconnected from sensory input and unable to form memories. It's still used medically for surgeries, particularly in field medicine and developing countries, and has recently been rebranded as a breakthrough treatment for depression. Recreationally, ketamine produces effects unlike any other common drug. Small doses create a dreamy, floating sensation, You feel slightly drunk and slightly removed from your body. Coordination becomes difficult, speech slurs, and there's a pleasant sense of being cushioned from reality. Users describe feeling like they're moving through honey or watching themselves from slightly outside their body. It's weird, not necessarily pleasant but interesting, and for some people that strange dissociation is exactly what they're seeking. Higher doses take you somewhere else entirely. The K-hole is ketamine's signature experience, a state of complete dissociation where you lose connection to your body, your environment, and sometimes your identity. You're not unconscious, but you're not present either. You exist as pure consciousness in some abstract space, experiencing visions, entities, impossible geometries, or simply a void where self and world have both dissolved. Some people find this terrifying, others find it transcendent. Either way, you're completely incapacitated, unable to move or communicate, essentially furniture until the drug wears off. The experience is dose-dependent but also route-dependent. Snorting ketamine, the most common recreational method, produces effects within minutes that last 30 to 60 minutes. The powder burns terribly, your nose runs constantly, and you develop the distinctive ketamine drip taste in the back of your throat that's chemical and unpleasant. Injecting ketamine is faster and more intense, but most recreational users avoid needles. Eating it is inefficient because the liver metabolizes most of it before it reaches the brain. The physical effects are bizarre and sometimes disturbing. You lose coordination completely. Users stumble around like newborn giraffes, unable to judge distances or control their limbs properly. Speech becomes slurred or impossible. You develop nystagmus, rapid involuntary eye movements that make vision swim and shake. Your heart rate increases, blood pressure rises, and you might feel nauseous. At high doses, people lie motionless for extended periods, appearing almost catatonic, while internally experiencing whatever dimension the K-hole has taken them to. The bladder damage from chronic ketamine use is a particularly horrifying side effect that wasn't initially recognized. Long-term users develop ketamine-induced cystitis, a painful inflammation of the bladder lining that can progress to the point where people need to urinate every 15 minutes, often in small amounts accompanied by severe pain and sometimes blood. In extreme cases, bladders become so scarred and damaged that they need to be surgically removed and replaced with reconstructed organs made from intestinal tissue. It's a fate worse than most drug consequences, and it's irreversible. Cognitive effects from chronic use include memory problems, difficulty concentrating, and a general sense of being cognitively dulled. Users describe feeling stupid, unable to think clearly or remember things that should be simple. The dissociation that seems fun recreationally becomes permanent dissociation from normal cognitive function. Your brain literally changes structure with heavy use, and those changes may not fully reverse even after stopping. The addiction potential is primarily psychological, but intense. Ketamine doesn't produce physical withdrawal, but users develop powerful compulsions to use repeatedly. The dissociation becomes a way to escape from self, from problems, from consciousness itself. Some users dose multiple times daily, maintaining a constant state of disconnect from reality. They lose jobs, relationships, and months of time to perpetual K-holes, emerging occasionally to redose and disappear again. The demographic is interesting. Ketamine appeals to club kids and psychonauts, to people seeking anesthesia from consciousness, and people exploring altered states for philosophical or spiritual reasons. It's crossed over from underground rave culture to mainstream acceptance, as medical clinics offer ketamine-assisted psychotherapy for depression, PTSD, and other conditions. This medical rebranding has made ketamine seem safer, or more legitimate, though the drug being prescribed in controlled medical settings is very different from the street powder of unknown purity being snorted in nightclub bathrooms. Street ketamine quality varies wildly. Sometimes it's pharmaceutical grade diverted from veterinary or medical supplies. Sometimes it's synthesized in clandestine labs with uncertain purity. Sometimes it's cut with other substances or isn't ketamine at all. Testing is advisable but rarely performed. You're trusting that the powder you bought is what you were told it is, which is a gamble that sometimes ends with you in a K-hole and sometimes ends with you having taken a completely different drug with completely different effects. The price, $200 to $300 per gram, reflects both the synthesis difficulty and the demand from multiple user demographics. A gram contains many doses, with typical lines being 50 to 100 milligrams depending on desired intensity, so that $300 purchase might last weeks of occasional use or days of heavy use, depending on how deep down the dissociative rabbit hole you're willing to go. For $200 to $300, you can purchase a gram of powder that will disconnect you from your body, your mind, and possibly your entire sense of self. You might have profound experiences of ego death and cosmic understanding, or you might just spend an hour unable to move while your brain does confusing things in abstract spaces. You might damage your bladder irreparably, or you might use occasionally without major consequences. It's the dissociative lottery. Sometimes you win insights, sometimes you win incapacitation, and occasionally you win permanent urological problems that require explaining to doctors why you destroyed your own bladder by snorting horse tranquilizer. That's ketamine medical anesthetic turned recreational dissociative, providing everything from gentle float to complete ego dissolution. Now available in both street and clinical settings with wildly different contexts, but fundamentally the same weird, disconnecting, occasionally transcendent chemical experience. Medium quality cocaine is what dealers sell to people who've complained about the baby laxative taste, but can't quite afford the premium stuff yet. It costs about as much as car repairs, and it delivers a high that's noticeably cleaner than the cheap stuff. More confidence, less paranoia, and fewer heart palpitations that make you wonder if this is the dose that finally kills you. We're talking about cocaine that's maybe 50 to 60% pure, which in the world of street drugs is practically pharmaceutical grade. It's been cut less frequently, travelled through fewer hands, and presumably wasn't stored in someone's sweaty sock during transport. The difference is immediately noticeable. The powder is finer, more crystalline, and produces a high that's sharper and more euphoric, without the jittery anxiety that accompanies heavily cut product. The high from medium-quality cocaine is what people imagine when they think of the drug supreme confidence, razor-sharp mental clarity, and the unshakable conviction that you're the most interesting person who's ever lived. Conversations flow effortlessly. You're witty, charming, impossibly articulate about subjects you barely understand. Ideas come rapidly, each one seeming more brilliant than the last. You feel powerful, successful, attractive, and completely in control. This is the cocaine of movies and rap lyrics, the substance that makes you feel like you're winning at life, even if objectively you're just talking too fast in a bathroom at 3 a.m. The euphoria is more pronounced with cleaner product. There's an actual rush, a wave of pleasure that hits within seconds of insufflation, originating somewhere deep in your brain and radiating outward. Your pupils dilate so wide that your eyes look black. Your heart rate increases, but not to the terrifying irregular pounding of a low-quality stuff. The numbing effect when you rub it on your gums is stronger and more complete. Everything about the experience feels premium, which makes sense because you're paying premium prices. But the fundamental problem with cocaine remains unchanged regardless of quality. The high is criminally brief. Medium-quality coke might last 30 to 45 minutes instead of 20, but you're still looking at less than an hour before you crash back into restless dissatisfaction. And because the high is better, the crash feels worse by comparison. You've experienced something genuinely pleasurable, and now it's gone, and your brain is screaming for more with an intensity that overrides every other consideration. The compulsive redosing pattern becomes even more pronounced with better cocaine. When the stuff is good, the desire to maintain that feeling is overwhelming. You tell yourself you'll just do one more line to extend the experience slightly, but 1 becomes 2 becomes 6, and suddenly you've blown through your entire supply in a few hours. The better the cocaine, the harder it is to moderate consumption, because why would you want to stop feeling this good? Physical side effects are still present but less severe. Your heart pounds but doesn't feel like it's trying to escape your chest. You sweat but not profusely. Your jaw clenches but you can still speak coherently. The nasal damage accumulates more slowly because you're snorting less adulterants, though you're still destroying your nasal passages just with relatively pure cocaine instead of baby laxative. Progress, kind of. The social dynamics around medium-quality cocaine are interesting. This is the tier where sharing becomes more selective. When you've paid $300 to $400 for a gram, you're not offering lines to everyone at the party anymore. You share with close friends, romantic interests, and people you're trying to impress professionally or socially. Cocaine becomes social currency. Offering someone a line is a gesture of inclusion, friendship, or romantic interest. Refusing someone's request is a calculated social snub. The conversations on medium-quality cocaine are legendary for all the wrong reasons. Users talk endlessly, jumping from topic to topic with manic energy, absolutely convinced they're having profound insights and meaningful connections. In reality, they're dominating conversations, not listening to responses, and covering the same ground repeatedly without noticing. Sober people watching cocaine conversations can see the empty pattern immediately rapid-fire talking, with no actual communication happening, just overlapping monologues where everyone's waiting for their turn to speak and nobody's actually listening. The sexual dynamics are complicated. Cocaine is famous for increasing libido while simultaneously making sexual performance difficult or impossible, particularly for men. You want sex desperately, you're confident and forward about pursuing it, but when the moment arrives your body won't cooperate. This leads to frustration, more cocaine consumption to try to overcome the problem, which makes the problem worse. It's a cycle that spawned countless awkward bedroom moments and relationship problems. The come down from medium-quality cocaine is still miserable, just slightly less so. You're depleted, anxious, unable to sleep despite being exhausted. Your brain's dopamine stores are temporarily exhausted, leaving you unable to feel pleasure or motivation. Everything seems pointless. The euphoria of an hour ago might as well be a distant memory from someone else's life. You're left with a choice: accept the misery and try to sleep it off, or do more cocaine to postpone the crash. The demographic shifts at this price point. You're leaving behind casual users and entering the territory of people with disposable income professionals, dealers, trust fund beneficiaries, and people whose cocaine use has progressed to the point where quality matters more than price. These are people who've done enough cocaine to recognize the difference between bad and good product, and they're willing to pay for the upgrade. The supply chain is shorter at this level. Medium-quality cocaine typically means fewer intermediaries have cut it, which often means buying from dealers who are closer to the source or have better connections. You're not buying from your friend's cousin anymore. You're buying from someone who moves significant volume and has reputation to maintain. The transaction feels more professional, more serious, and comes with the understanding that both parties are engaged in meaningful criminality. The financial burden escalates dramatically. At $300 to $400 per gram, even occasional use becomes expensive. A weekend session can easily burn through $500 or more. Monthly costs can rival rent payments. Users start making financial decisions that prioritize cocaine over necessities, borrowing money they can't repay, or finding ways to monetize their access to good product by becoming dealers themselves. For $300 to $400, You can purchase a gram of cocaine that's actually enjoyable rather than just stimulating, that produces genuine euphoria rather than jittery anxiety. And that makes you feel like the gods intended you to feel when they invented confidence. You'll talk endlessly about nothing, bond intensely with people you'll barely remember tomorrow, and spend 45 minutes convinced you're having the best night of your life before crashing into the worst hour of your week. You'll wake up poorer, slightly more damaged, and already thinking about when you can afford to do it again. That's medium-quality cocaine good enough to remember why people love this drug, expensive enough to create financial problems, and precisely addictive enough to make you willing to pay these prices repeatedly despite knowing better. It's the sweet spot where cocaine becomes not just a drug but a lifestyle expense, a hobby that costs more than most hobbies should, and a substance that's just good enough to make you forget that you're slowly bankrupting yourself, one nostril-destroying line at a time. Pure MDMA is what ecstasy wants to be when it grows up. No adulterants, no mystery ingredients, just crystalline empathy in powder form. A gram costs about as much as concert tickets and delivers a high that makes you want to hug strangers, confess your deepest feelings, and dance until sunrise while experiencing levels of joy you didn't know were biochemically possible. The come down, predictably, is devastating. We're talking about MDMA that's 85 to 95% pure, tested, verified, and as close to laboratory grade as street drugs get. The crystals are chunky and translucent, ranging from white to light brown, and they look distinctly different from the pressed pills and suspicious powders that claim to be ecstasy, but contain mostly methadone and false promises. This is the real thing, the substance that researchers use in clinical trials, the chemical that produces the effects MDMA is famous for without the contamination that causes most of the problems. The experience begins with what users call the come-up, 30 to 45 minutes after ingesting when the MDMA starts hitting your system. This phase can be uncomfortable slight nausea, a feeling of tension or anxiety, awareness that something is changing. Some people get jittery or nervous during the come-up, wondering if they took too much, if it's going to be overwhelming, if they're going to be okay. And then, like sunrise breaking over mountains, the peak arrives and everything becomes okay in ways you didn't know were possible. Pure MDMA produces a cascade of effect centered around overwhelming empathy, emotional openness, and euphoria. The world becomes soft and beautiful. Music sounds transcendent, every note reaching directly into your soul, every beat perfectly synchronized with your heartbeat. Physical sensations intensify. Touching fabric, hugging friends, or dancing feel extraordinarily pleasurable. Your jaw clenches involuntarily, which is annoying but manageable. Your pupils dilate until your eyes are mostly black. You sweat freely despite not feeling hot, and emotionally you're opened completely. The empathy is MDMA's signature effect. Suddenly you love everyone deeply, genuinely, without reservation. Your friends are the most amazing people you've ever known. Strangers at this rave are your brothers and sisters in experience. You want to tell everyone how much they mean to you, how beautiful they are, how grateful you are for their existence. And remarkably, this isn't shallow or false. In the moment, these feelings are completely genuine. MDMA temporarily dissolves the emotional barriers that usually keep people at arm's length. Conversations on MDMA are legendary. People share things they've never told anyone. Childhood traumas, secret fears, profound hopes. Emotional intimacy that normally takes months to develop happens in hours. Friendships deepen, romantic relationships intensify, and people experience a level of connection that feels sacred and transcendent. This is why MDMA is being studied for PTSD therapy. The drug creates a window where people can confront difficult emotions without being overwhelmed by anxiety or fear. The physical side effects are present but manageable with pure MDMA. Your body temperature rises, which combined with dancing in crowded venues can become dangerous. Overheating and dehydration are real risks that kill people at festivals. Harm reduction advice is simple: drink water regularly, take breaks from dancing and don't overheat. Your jaw clenches and grinds involuntarily, leading people to chew gum compulsively or wear through their teeth enamel if they roll frequently. Some people experience eye wiggles, rapid involuntary eye movements that blur vision. None of this diminishes the experience. These are just the physiological costs of flooding your brain with serotonin. The peak lasts 3 to 5 hours, depending on dose and individual metabolism. Users often describe it as the best they've ever felt, not just happy or high, but fundamentally okay with themselves and the universe. Problems that seemed overwhelming earlier now seem manageable. Trauma that's haunted you for years feels processable. You're not escaping reality. You're experiencing reality with all the emotional armor removed, and underneath that armor is a core of joy and connection you'd forgotten existed. And then it ends. The come down from pure MDMA is gentler than from contaminated ecstasy, but it's still difficult. As serotonin levels drop, so does mood. The profound joy fades, leaving you emotionally depleted. The next few days, sometimes called Suicide Tuesday if you rolled on the weekend, can feature depression, anxiety, difficulty concentrating, and a general sense that colour has drained from the world. Your brain has dumped its serotonin reserves, and it takes time to replenish them. The neurotoxicity question haunts MDMA use. Research suggests that MDMA can damage serotonin neurons with repeated use, potentially causing long-term changes in mood, cognition, and emotional regulation. The evidence is mixed. Some studies show damage, others don't. But the general consensus is that frequent use, more than once every few months, carries real risks. Your brain needs time to recover between rolls, and ignoring that recovery period invites consequences. Harm reduction practices are essential with MDMA. Test your drugs to verify they're actually MDMA and not something more dangerous. Don't redose. The second dose doesn't produce the same magic, just more side effects and more neurotoxicity risk. Space out usage. Rolling more than once a month means diminishing returns and increasing damage. Manage your body temperature and hydration. Take supplements like magnesium for jaw clenching and antioxidants to potentially reduce neurotoxicity. These aren't guarantees of safety, but they significantly reduce risks. The purity makes an enormous difference in the experience. People who've tried both pressed pills and pure MDMA report that pure is cleaner, more emotional, less speedy, and produces less anxiety. The come down is still real, but less crushing. The magic is stronger and more reliable. You're getting the MDMA experience without the contaminants that cause most of the problems. No methamphetamine speeding you out, no caffeine making you jittery, no mystery chemicals doing mystery things to your brain. The price, $300 to $500 per gram, reflects both purity and scarcity. A gram contains roughly 10 doses at 100 milligrams each, though many users take 100 and 150 mean for a full experience. That works out to $30 to $50 per roll, which is expensive but justifiable for people who treat MDMA as an occasional sacred experience rather than a weekly party drug. The high price actually serves as harm reduction. It's expensive, enough to prevent daily use. The market for pure MDMA is relatively small and specialized. Most people buying Molly on the street are getting questionable purity at best. Pure MDMA typically comes from people connected to dark web markets, from chemists who care about product quality, or from the small-scale synthesis community where people make it for personal use rather than profit. Finding consistently pure MDMA requires networking, knowledge, and patience. It's not the kind of thing you score from a random dealer at a club. For $300 to $500, you can purchase a gram of powder that will provide 10 profound experiences of love, connection, and joy that temporarily restore your faith in humanity and remind you that consciousness can be beautiful. You'll hug friends with genuine affection, dance with abandon, and experience emotions so pure and powerful that normal life seems muted by comparison. You'll also deplete your serotonin, risk neurotoxicity if you overuse it, and spend several days afterward feeling emotionally hungover while your brain chemistry rebalances. That's pure MDMA, the empathy drug, the hug drug, the reminder that humans are capable of profound connection when their emotional defenses are chemically disabled. It's powerful, relatively safe when used responsibly, and produces experiences people remember fondly decades later. It's also a drug that demands respect. Use it too frequently or carelessly, and the magic disappears, leaving only side effects and the memory of something beautiful you can no longer access. That's the paradox. MDMA works best when used rarely. But the experience is so good that resisting more frequent use requires willpower most people don't have. So here we are, at the end of the darkest economics lesson you never asked for but probably needed. We've travelled from dollar store nightmares to substances that cost more than used cars, from gas station gambles to pharmaceutical-grade powders that require dark web connections and cryptocurrency wallets. We've ranked them by price, but the real cost was never about money, was it? Every substance on this list represents the same fundamental human impulse, the desire to feel different than we currently feel, to escape pain, to enhance pleasure, to quiet anxiety, to sharpen focus, to connect more deeply, or simply to make the unbearable weight of consciousness slightly more bearable for a few hours. These aren't moral failings packaged in baggies and pills. They're solutions to problems, inadequate, dangerous, often catastrophic solutions, but solutions nonetheless to very real suffering that society has failed to address in healthier ways. The progression from cheap to expensive tells a story about desperation, about how some people are so broke or so young or so desperate that they'll huff household chemicals or drink entire bottles of cough syrup. And it tells a story about privilege, about how having money doesn't protect you from addiction, but it does change which addictions are available and which are socially acceptable. The executive snorting pure cocaine in a corporate bathroom and the teenager huffing paint behind a convenience store are engaged in the same fundamental act, chemical escapism, but society treats them very differently. What's remarkable, looking at this list, is how arbitrary the legal distinctions are. Some of the most dangerous substances are perfectly legal, sold in gas stations, prescribed by doctors, marketed aggressively to vulnerable populations. Others, potentially therapeutic and relatively safe, remain Schedule 1, classified alongside the deadliest drugs as having no medical value. The law doesn't track harm. It tracks history, politics, racism, and corporate lobbying. Alcohol and tobacco kill more people than all illegal drugs combined, but they're sold in every corner store. Cannabis is slowly being legalized, while psilocybin, which has shown remarkable promise for treating depression and PTSD, remains illegal in most places. The system doesn't make sense because it was never designed to make sense. It was designed to control populations and protect profits. And then there's the fentanyl crisis, the shadow hanging over this entire list. It doesn't matter if you're buying cheap heroin or expensive cocaine. There's a chance it's been contaminated with fentanyl or one of its analogues. Substances so potent that a few grains can stop your breathing permanently. The illicit. Drug suppliers become Russian roulette, and users are dying in numbers that would spark national emergencies if they were caused by anything other than drugs. Tens of thousands of people each year mostly young, dying not because they wanted to die, but because they wanted to get high, and the substance they bought wasn't what they thought it was. The price tags we've discussed, from $1 to $50,000, represent more than market economics. They represent lives, families, communities. That $3 synthetic cannabinoid might seem trivial until it's your teenager seizing on a bathroom floor. That $300 gram of MDMA might seem like harmless fun until your best friend overheats at a festival and doesn't make it to the hospital in time. That $500 prescription bottle might seem like legitimate medicine until your parent can't function without it, and withdrawal puts them in the ICU. None of this is meant to be preachy or moralistic. Drug use is older than civilization. Humans have been altering consciousness for as long as we've had consciousness to alter. We're not going to shame or arrest our way out of addiction. Decades of the war on drugs have proven that prohibition doesn't work. It just makes drugs more dangerous, more expensive, and more likely to ruin lives through incarceration rather than overdose. What works is harm reduction testing substances, providing clean needles, offering treatment without judgment, addressing the underlying pain and trauma that make escapism appealing in the first place. If you're someone who uses drugs, whether occasionally or compulsively, whether socially acceptable ones or criminalized ones, please be as safe as possible. Test your substances if you can. Don't use alone. Know the signs of overdose and keep naloxone nearby. Understand that tolerance makes yesterday's safe dose today's fatal one. Space out your usage. Stay hydrated. Watch your mental health. And most importantly, remember that addiction isn't a moral failing. It's a chronic illness that can happen to anyone, and recovery is possible even when it doesn't feel like it. If you're someone who doesn't use drugs but knows someone who does, maybe approach them with compassion rather than judgment. They're not bad people making bad choices. They're suffering people trying to survive with inadequate tools. Love them, support them, keep them alive until they're ready to get help. Don't enable, but don't abandon. The difference between someone who recovers and someone who dies is often just whether they had people who cared enough to stick around during the worst of it. And if you're someone who's struggling right now, who's reading this while high or sick, or contemplating whether today's the day you try to quit or the day you give up entirely, please know that you're worth more than your addiction thinks you are. Your brain is lying to you when it says you can't survive without drugs. Recovery is possible. Treatment works. Life can be good again, even though right now it seems impossible. Reach out to someone. Call a helpline. Show up at a meeting. Check yourself into detox. Do whatever it takes to survive one more day, because tomorrow might be the day something clicks and you finally catch a break. The substances on this list will still be here tomorrow and next year, and probably for the rest of human history. We're not going to eliminate drugs, and we shouldn't be trying to. What we should be trying to eliminate is the suffering that makes drugs seem like the only solution, the stigma that prevents people from seeking help, the prohibition that makes drug use more dangerous than it needs to be, and the inequality that makes some addictions sympathized with while others are criminalized. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, maybe in your comfortable bed with your clean water and your legal substances and your relative safety, think about the millions of people for whom the choice isn't whether to use drugs, but which drugs they can afford and whether today's high will be their last. Think about the kids huffing inhalants because they can't access therapy. Think about the chronic pain patients cut off from medication, who turn to street heroin because their suffering was unbearable. Think about the veterans with PTSD self-medicating with whatever numbs the memories. Think about the teenagers at raves who just wanted to dance and ended up in body bags because nobody taught them. Harm reduction. This list wasn't meant to be a shopping guide or an endorsement. It was meant to be a map of human suffering, priced and packaged, bought and sold in markets that thrive on desperation. Every dollar amount represents choices made in moments of pain, celebration, curiosity, or hopelessness. and every substance from the cheapest to the most expensive carries the same warning label that nobody ever reads. This might solve your problems temporarily, but it will create new problems permanently. The economics of drugs are simple: supply meets demand. Prices reflect scarcity and risk, and humans will always pay whatever they can afford to feel different than they currently feel. But the human cost is incalculable, measured not in dollars but in lives interrupted, potential unrealized, families destroyed, and futures traded for a few hours of escape that never quite delivers on its promises. Stay safe out there. Test your drugs. Love your people. Seek help if you need it. And remember that the best high isn't found in powders or pills or substances that cost anywhere from $1 to $1,000 per hit. The best high is waking up clear-headed, healthy, connected to people you love and at peace with yourself, which might sound impossibly boring when you're chasing chemical euphoria, but is actually the goal everyone's looking for, just without the shortcuts that tend to become dead ends. Sleep well, be kind to yourself and others, and maybe tomorrow, let's all work toward building a world where people don't need to escape quite so desperately, where pain is treated rather than criminalized, and where the question isn't how much drugs cost but why we need them so badly in the first place. Good night.